Hello and welcome back to the Showing Up to Life podcast and YouTube channel. My name is Art Burns, here with you on a Friday afternoon. Not sure what day you're listening to this, but in my world, it's Friday afternoon, and I'm really happy to be here with you today. And actually, I missed you all yesterday, so I just want you to know that. So in this podcast and YouTube channel, for any of you who are just joining us, we talk here about techniques, we talk about concepts, we talk about ideas and philosophies, but most importantly, we talk about practices that help us to show up in the present moment, because what we understand in this podcast is that the present moment is all we ever have, right? That anything outside of the present moment is purely imagination. And I know everybody's saying, well, what about the past? The past actually happened. You can't say it didn't happen. No, you're right. You're right. But when you remember the past, when you right now call up a memory of something that happened, right? Do it right now. Anything. In this moment, you are remembering that event in your life from your present moment nervous system, is one way I like to look at it. I mean, there's certainly the status of your emotions and all that is involved with the nervous system. But my point is that if you right now are feeling real happy, hey, I'm watching Art's video and listening to Art's podcast, this always makes me happy. And so when I ask you to remember something from the past, because of the happiness you're experiencing in this moment, you're going to remember that thing from the past as more favorable or more happy. It's just the way it works. And so in that way, the past is not real. It really isn't. It is, the past exists. Sure, there exists an objective record of what happened. I went to a certain school. My first car was a 76 Buick Regal that my friend gave me for driving him to the airport. I went to, I had this girlfriend. I had that girlfriend. I had this friend. I went to that concert. That all happened, right? There's an objective reality to that. But when I remember that right now, that is not any kind of science or any kind of, impartial, unbiased memory. It just doesn't happen that way. A lot of times we think that memory is like going into our computer, right? And we go into our little directory and we find that file and we double click on it and we open up that file, and that's the file that's just been there ever since the first time we opened it. That is not the way that memory works. And of course, that's not the way that the future works either, right? Because, the future we can recognize that hasn't happened yet. So we know that that is, imagination. But the point is, and the important thing to recognize, that happens in both directions. That when we're remembering something of the past, we're doing so, the remembering is a present moment activity. Okay, that's an important thing to remember or to recognize. Now, when we experience our present moment experience, right, if we tend to judge something, or if we do judge something, right, we judge something as good or we judge something as bad. We judge something as positive or negative, or happy or sad, or yes or no, right? And when we do that judgment, right, when we say this is a good thing, then what we are going to tend to do is we're going to tend to cling to that thing that we believe is good, right? I used to do this on vacations all the time, right? Like halfway through a vacation, I'm thinking about, oh no, this vacation is going to end in 3 more days. This is terrible. Right. So what's actually happening in that moment, because I'm clinging to the idea that this vacation should last forever, I'm actually taking away my enjoyment of this day on my vacation, and in all likelihood the next 2 or 3 days, just thinking about the fact that I have to get on the plane, I have to pack, I have to go home, I have to go back to work and all that kind of stuff, right? So even though it's something positive that I'm clinging to, right, I'm judging this vacation as good, right? It's something that I'm clinging to, but the clinging is a fear-based action. It's a fear-based mindset, which means that it's steeped in the negative emotions. Now, the other alternative to that, the counterforce of clinging, is aversion. So if I believe that something, or if I judge something as being bad, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to feel, no, 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 I can't have this. This is terrible. This cannot exist for me. And what's happening then is that I'm causing myself to suffer by that aversion, right? Because again, that is fear, right? Technically, what these two things, aversion and clinging, are mental states, right? But from these mental states, only negative emotions will arise. Now, that is not to say that we can't experience negative emotions without aversion or clinging, right? Sometimes we're just in a neutral state and we have a memory, right? Like something pops into our mind, a pet that we've lost in our lives, or a person we've lost in our lives, or something that causes an emotion that's negative. Now, remembering that negative emotions do not mean bad emotions. There's no such thing as a bad emotion. There's an emotion that's negative that pushes us away from something, like fear, avoidance, right? Or there's an emotion that draws us closer to something, like love, attraction, right? So it's not good or bad. It's just positive or negative, like the poles on a battery or on a magnet, right? If you have a magnet on one polarity, it's going to push the other magnet away. You flip the magnet over and it connects, right? That's what the emotions are. No different from that. But the important thing is to remember, again, that from the mental states of clinging or aversion, we are only going to experience negative emotions. That's science. That's the way it works, right? Now, the important thing to remember there is that the negative mental states of clinging and aversion are what they call inhibited, mutually prohibitive, I think is the word they call, or mutually inhibitive, I believe it's called, which is to say that we cannot experience aversion and clinging and at the same time experience acceptance or letting go. You can't be both at the same time. You're either in the negative mental states or you're in the positive mental states, which is to say that you're either inviting negative emotions or you're inviting positive emotions. Okay? So now that's where we usually talk about all this stuff, the aversion and the clinging, right? And the reason why, and it's not just me and not just this podcast, but all these books and stuff, right? They really highlight the aversion and the clinging because these are the things that we see, right? We see it's like an action, right? Like aversion is it's a direct response that we have to this experience. So it's very easy to sort of see it when it's happening. Not necessarily easy to see it, but we can train ourselves to see it very readily, okay? But these are just two of what the Buddhism philosophy calls the three poisons. Okay, and the first one is very rarely, and I do say it's the first one, not the third one, okay, because it's so much more rarely talked about and so much more rarely examined because it's a little less solid. It's a little less tangible, if you will, okay? And what I'm talking about is the mental state of delusion. Now, sometimes you might hear it referred to as ignorance, right? Depending on which Buddhism book that you're reading, right? But the important thing to understand is not whether it's delusion or ignorance. Before I get into that, though, first of all, if we are calling it delusion, we're not calling it delusion in the sense of like a psychiatric sense of delusion, right? Like where it's like you are completely, separated from reality and you're living in delusions and hallucinations and stuff like that. That's not what. Of course, that is just a very superlative form of what I'm talking about here, right? But what I'm talking about is much more subtle than that, right? It's just a mental state that happens all the time, right? But the really important thing to understand about aversion and clinging is that in almost every circumstance, and I mean 99.999%, the aversion and the clinging arise from the delusion, okay? Aversion and clinging in almost every circumstance arises from delusion, which is just to say that we're not seeing things as they really are, but we're instead seeing things through what we're experiencing. Okay? I think it was the poet Rumi who said, we don't experience the world the way the world is, we experience the world the way we are. Okay? Of course, he would have said it much more poetically. That's why they call him a poet. But I don't remember the exact quote. But that's the reality, right? And one of the biggest delusions that we can ever experience, and this absolutely gives way to the clinging and the aversion and is the source of almost all of our negative emotions. Which is to say, now, yes, negative emotions are not bad emotions, but negative emotions produce uncomfortable feelings, right? So when we're experiencing negative emotions, it is always sort of the goal or the process is always to come back to a positive emotion. Right? It's not to avoid the negative emotion, not to say that that's bad and I shouldn't be experiencing that, but we should allow the negative emotion to push us into an action that puts us back into a mental state that produces positive emotions, because the negative emotions are really associated with stress, right? And when we're feeling the negative emotions and our body is reacting with stress, that's actually not healthy for us, right? That's actually pushing all the blood away from all of our organs, which is really not good for our organs, okay? So even though it's not a bad thing to feel a negative emotion, it is something that we should remember is always trying to push us back to a place of well-being, which is a positive mental state, which will produce positive emotions. Okay, so it's important to remember we're not avoiding negative emotions, but we are trying to move towards positive emotions, right? But not doing so with denial, doing so with the opposite of the three poisons, right? The three poisons are the negative mental states of delusion, aversion, clinging. The positive mental states that are the opposites of these, right? Sorry, my words aren't coming to me this morning. The opposites of delusion, aversion, and clinging are non-judging awareness, letting go, and acceptance. To be clear, non-judging awareness is the opposite of delusion. Letting go is the opposite of clinging, and acceptance is the opposite of aversion. So it's not to say that how do I cheer myself up? How do I get rid of this negative emotion that I'm feeling? No, it's saying, what do I need to let go of right now in order to free myself from these negative emotions? Or what do I need to accept right now? And then again, most importantly, which is usually not the first question we ask because we first see the aversion and the clinging, but really the big question to ask is, what am I not seeing accurately about this situation? Or how can I look at this situation in a different way that promotes letting go or acceptance, right? That's a more healthy way to look at it. But I want to talk today about this delusion, right? We're already talking about it, obviously, but the delusion is perhaps, again, even though it's the thing that we tend to think of last, it really should be the first, step in our understanding, if you will. The good news is that there's one of the most common delusions that we all experience 100% of the time in our lives. And that is expectation, right? Now, expectation's a tricky thing, right? Because your brain, right, as a function of the organ of your brain, the function of that organ is to anticipate what is coming next. That's how you keep yourself safe, right? Your brain is constantly taking in all the stimuli that it's experiencing. Right. And what it's doing is very quickly, it's comparing this stimulus that I'm experiencing right now. It's comparing in the background, not a conscious thing. This is very implicit and very fast. Okay. But very quickly, it's comparing and associating this stimuli with every stimuli in every circumstance that I've ever been in my life. Now, your brain has a really good tool for highlighting the things that were especially emotional, right? So something is really, really happy, you're going to remember. Something that's really, really troubling, you're going to remember. You're not going to remember some of the lower level stuff, right? But in the association of your brain, that's what it's doing. It's saying, okay, is this like something that was a negative experience for me? In which case, I need to be afraid and cautious. Or is this associated with something that's positive and happy? In which case, I can feel safe, right? But again, I can very easily slip into the clinging when I feel that this is, oh yeah, this is something good. I should grip onto this. Now, all of a sudden, I'm working against myself, okay? But getting back to the big delusion, right? The biggest delusion we have is, I'm sorry, again, I sidetrack myself a little bit. I do that a lot. When we're so the problem or the trickiness of this, right, is that our brain wants to always do that, right? Our brain always wants to set us up with an expectation, right? But the important thing to remember is that your brain is doing so with a different set of priorities, right? Your brain just wants you to be safe. It doesn't care if you're happy or not happy. It doesn't care about these other people around you. I mean, it does. There's a function of your brain that very much cares about the other people around you, or at least senses and is connected to the other people. But your brain really is worried about your health, not that person's health. Not first, anyway. And so, and when I say health, I mean immediate health. Like right now, am I safe? It's not worried about chronic stress that could be destroying your body over time. No, your brain's saying, hey, every time I've experienced this, I've gone into the stress response and I've survived. So I'm going to do that again, right? So that's where the anticipation that your brain, and the association that your brain is creating, it feels like expectation. So therefore it feels like, well, what's wrong with that? But as I just explained to you, sometimes it's very wrong. Sometimes it's very harmful for us to experience that, right? But even in a less sort of neuronal sense, right? And just in a matter of fact, moment by moment experience sense, right? We have a great tendency, because of this function of our brain, we have a great tendency to set ourselves up for expectations, right? Now, expectations can exist, okay, I have, tickets to a basketball game with my son, I expect that we're going to have a good time, right? That's one form of expectation. But another form of expectation is that, that I expect to somehow be something that, whatever it is, like there's certain expectation that I deserve to be in a certain status or certain state of being right now. But there is no such guarantee. None of us are brought into this world with a contract, right? Before we come into the world, we're not presented with a contract that says, okay, here's how everything's going to work for you this, over the next 80 years or whatever, right? None of us know what that is. I was recently reading a book that y'all might really enjoy. I'm actually getting into it for the second time, but it really talks about trauma, and it really talks about specifically how to, how to mend the relationships with your parents, specifically your mother. And that's something that's hard for me based on the trauma that I'm dealing with right now. So I've actually put the book down a couple of times. But I just recently read, again, I don't get past like the first chapter, but in the introduction. So first of all, the book is called It Didn't Start With You. It's fascinating stuff. The last time I did read it, I got to the point where, and this was before I recognized the trauma that I had from my childhood, so it was easier for me to approach it. But one of the things that he talks about in this book is that, the name of the author, by the way, is Mark Wolyn, Wollyn, I believe. It Didn't Start With You is the name of the book. And one of the aspects that he talks about in the way that it didn't start with us is that, when your mother was in your grandmother's womb, okay, at about 4 months of gestation, right? So at the point that your mother was an embryo, At 4 months of gestation, your mother's embryonic body contained every ova that it would ever create. Which is to say that the ova that created you, the egg that was inside your mother that became you, was in your grandmother's body when your grandmother was 4 months pregnant. Which means that everything you experienced, or everything your grandmother experienced, and for me, my grandmother was experiencing like the Great Depression, right? Well, not quite. I mean, it was like, in between World War I and World War II, very poor, very, very hard life my grandmother lived. While my mother was, in there, right? Her processes of managing the cortisol, regulating cortisol and adrenaline, and essentially her tools for managing the stress were developed in that time of enormous stress that my grandmother was feeling, and I experienced it all with her. So that means that my nervous system comes from that, right? Or at least it was impacted very greatly by the cortisol that my grandmother was experiencing while my mother was 4 months pregnant while I was in my mother. Okay? Intense. And the same thing happens with sperm cells. There's a fascinating story that was done, an experiment rather, that was done in Vancouver, I believe it was. They have a mouse, right? And they expose. It's a very simple, very common, almost like the Pavlovian kind of experiment. Nothing groundbreaking. They expose the mouse to a specific smell in this case, right? Let's call it rotten eggs, right? But a smell that could be very controlled, right? So they expose the mouse to this smell, and as soon as they see the mouse twitching, and as soon as the smell is present, they shock the mouse, right, with a little electricity in the cage, right? And they do this over and over and over to the point where as soon as that mouse smells that smell, it knows it's getting shocked. Okay? So they did that for a period of time, and then they stopped. And then they let that mouse mate with a female mouse. Okay? The baby of that mouse, right? A male baby of that mouse, they separate the male. They never expose that baby mouse to the smell or the shock for its entire life. That mouse becomes mature, and they allow that mouse to mate. Now, the male child, so now the grandson of the original mouse that was exposed to this smell and the shock, right? There's a whole generation of no smell and no shock in between, okay? But now this grandchild mouse, this grandson, they expose it to the smell. And as soon as that mouse smelled that smell, it went into like braced for that shock. 2 generations away, folks. So this is important to recognize that we are not as in control of everything as we think we are, right? That I did not create my nervous system. I did not even have the benefit of forming it entirely throughout my own life. And now this is part of why I have expectations that I do, right? And so anyway, the point that I was really the point of referencing this book is that in the introduction, one of the things that led this author into this this journey of discovery and trying to kind of figure all this out was that he was actually experiencing a very traumatic physical thing where he was losing his eyesight in one of his eyes. It's a very rare condition. He was diagnosed, medically, there's nothing anybody could do for him. So what he did was he decided to go a spiritual route. And he had a business in San Francisco that he kind of sold to his partner. And he went off to India and went from one monastery to another, to another, to another, to see if there's anything that anybody could help him with this, right? And he was frustrated at every turn. He was just not getting anything. In fact, all anybody was saying was, you got to go home and reconnect with your parents. And that's where I put the book down. But because that's not possible for all of us, right? And this person did not experience heavy trauma as a child. He described that. So it's not, you shouldn't feel bad that you can't do that, okay? That's important. But anyway, at one of these monasteries, he finally, one of the gurus that he finally talked to said the thing that changed everything for him. And what he said was, who are you to not have an eye problem? Who are you not to lose sight in your right eye? Now, that's heavy, right? Because the thing is that we have these expectations. We have the expectation that my life should be a certain thing, right? I am entitled to this life that I envision. But that is a delusion. That is just not true. I mean, I say that with a smile because, when we can embrace this, when we can accept this, then we no longer have this expectation. We no longer have this delusion. Because the problem is that once I expect that something is going to happen in my life, I expect that my kids are going to grow up in a certain way. I expect that my spouse is going to act in a certain way. I expect that my car is going to start in the morning when I get out there. I expect that there's going to be no traffic on the way to work. I expect that it's going to be a sunny day out, right? That the minute I have those expectations, well, when the reality that I experience doesn't align with those expectations, that's when I experience aversion or clinging. Mostly aversion, right? Because when things do match the expectations, there's no problem, right? Like when I expect that my car is going to start and it starts, there's no problem there. There's no conflict, right? But when it doesn't start, that's when I have this expectation that this isn't fair. This is not okay that my car didn't start when I turned the key this morning. And in that process, once I say that, once I judge it as something that is bad and unfair, all I'm going to experience in that moment is aversion. And from that aversion, only negative emotions are going to arise. And remember, the negative emotions are there just to push us back to safety. So therefore, I'm not going to think of what could possibly be wrong here. Maybe it's something very simple that I can fix very quickly, even without mechanical expertise, right? Like, do I have the right key? So I used to have these two keys that one was only meant to open the door, and they call it a valet key, right? So you're not supposed to start the engine. But there were plenty of times where, oh my gosh, my car's not starting. There must be some huge problem here. What's going on? It's going to be thousands of dollars. How am I going to handle this? And it was just I had the wrong key, right? But this is the source of almost every fight we have, right? Like, I was recently talking to somebody who sent somebody a couple of text messages that they assumed were read, and then when they didn't get the desired response from these text messages they sent, they got angry. Because how dare this person ignore what I'm asking for? And then they got angry, and then they shouted, and they got into this whole fight and this whole thing, only to realize that the person never received the text messages. They went to a different number or something like that. Or their phone wasn't near them or something like that. But we get this idea in our heads that when I send a text message that it's going to be received. Pardon me. That's not always the case. That expectation, that expectation is a delusion. Just like the expectation that I can get through 30 minutes of talking without choking and coughing. It'd be very easy for me now to feel aversive towards this coughing and say, oh no, this whole podcast is ruined. I got to go back. I got to redo the whole thing. Oh, it's so frustrating. I don't have the time. I got an appointment. Oh my gosh, what am I going to do? Right? Who am I to expect that I'm not going to cough in a podcast? Who are you to expect that I'm not going to cough during a podcast? Now, you can choose to say, well, I don't listen to podcasts where people cough. And you'll be missing out on some of the valuable content that I'm producing just because of this expectation that you have, right? But that's your choice. And you're entitled to make that choice at any given time. That's the other thing here, is that clinging and aversion and delusion do not require us to do anything, right? We're allowed to feel, like we're allowed to not engage in something, right? We're allowed to set a boundary and say, no, I'm not doing that because it causes me to feel negative emotions. And so I don't want that. That's your choice. The problem is, though, that when we get into that no, this can't be, this is not fair, that's the emotion that's not going to serve you. That's the emotion that's going to carry you further from showing up in the moment. Right? Because once we're in that emotion, now we got all these thoughts and all these physical sensations that are going on that pull us away from whatever is happening in this present moment. And remember, it's all about showing up for life. And the only place and the only time that life ever happens is right here, right now. And so when I'm lost in this, aversion that I got to redo this podcast, I'm angry and this is all negative emotions flowing through me. My son comes down the stairs over here and says, "Hey, Dad, you want to hear this joke I just heard?" Of course I want to hear that joke. But in that moment, maybe not. In that moment, maybe I say, "Not right now." And then forever, my son associates wanting to tell his dad a joke with that angry reaction. And I've just driven a wedge in between my son in a picture that is so much bigger and so much more important than anything that could be happening on a podcast, on an individual podcast episode. Right? So here's how we work with this. Okay, because remember, I'm all about the practices here, just checking the time. I think we're a little over time here, so pardon me. But here's how we can work with this, okay? Because remember, any time that we're in the negative mental states of aversion, clinging, or delusion, we're only going to experience negative emotions. So in the moments where and we know what negative emotions feel like, right? They feel unpleasant by design. That's what they're supposed to feel like, because they're supposed to call our attention to something is not safe right now. We have to migrate into a place of safety, right? That's all your system is doing for you at any given moment. And so when we're feeling that tension, which is caused by the negative emotion, we can ask ourselves a very simple set of questions. Is there something in this moment I can accept? Is there something in this moment that requires me to let go of an expectation or some kind of idea? Or am I seeing things for as they really are? Or how can I identify how my memory, my expectations, whatever it is forming a delusion about what I'm experiencing? When you start asking yourselves those questions in the present moment, you start to get a better sense of what's going on. And as you get that better sense of what's going on, that becomes a wisdom, right? It becomes an intuitive wisdom that now in real time, I can see myself getting to like the expectations before they become the delusion and the aversion and the clinging, right? I can see going into something, oh, I better check my expectations. And that's how it happens over time, that it just becomes a skill. All right? Now, of course, as we practice just basic meditation and mindfulness practices informally, this is what we're cultivating, right? We're cultivating the awareness that helps us to see this automatically. So don't feel like you have to do anything specifically other than your regular practice. But anytime that you do feel yourself in that moment of tension, ask yourself those 3 questions. And whatever those answers come, accept what they are, and then act on those understandings. And generally speaking, that is how we can keep ourselves at least closer to our own window of tolerance where we're not becoming hyper or hypo aroused, which is to say anxious or depressed. All right. All right, folks, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I hope it was informative. I hope it was helpful. I want to know what you think, though. Okay, so please let me know if there's something that I said here that didn't seem clear, if there's something you don't agree with, if there's something that you want to know more about. I want to know. Okay, so please reach out either as a comment on the video. You can send me an email at art@artburnscoaching.com, or, as you know, there will be a link in the description of this video or podcast where you can book a free session with me. Okay, it's a 45-minute session. Every single one of you has one of these in your name. Okay, there's no cost, there's nothing. Just got to book it. Okay, so if you would like to talk, and it doesn't have to ever go further than that. Okay, this is not my way of like, oh, if I get one session, I'll be able to tell them what's wrong with everything and not give them any solutions. So then they got to hire me. That is not the game I play. Okay, that is a game most people play. It's not the game I play. For me, this is just 45 minutes of you and me talking and how I can help you within this 45 minutes. Okay? So I just want you to know that that's a resource that is available to you right now. All right, everybody. Thanks again for watching. Thanks for listening. I wish you well. I'll try to be back again tomorrow. Take care, everybody.